So now we turn to the Pacific Theater, which, although it was a lot further away, was no less important to the ultimate successful outcome of the war. This is where the first attack had been on Pearl Harbor, and in the aftermath of that attack, the next couple of months were nothing but one Japanese victory at a time after another, uh, including their ultimate objective, the Philippines, but also a lot of small American-held islands like Guam and Wake Island. In the spring of 1942, President Roosevelt wanted to just give the American people a little bit of hope that things could go better for us, and so he had the Navy and the Air Force organize a raid called the Doolittle Raid. It was led by a pilot by the name of James Doolittle, and this was just going to be just a shot in the dark, a real gamble, and ultimately not doing anything to bring the war to an end. But we just wanted to do something symbolic for both the Japanese and ourselves. So we put a bunch of B-25 bombers on an aircraft carrier called the Hornet. Now, land-based bombers that big are not supposed to take off from aircraft carriers. So we stripped these things down to basically nothing but skin and bones and bombs. And we loaded up the aircraft carrier. We snuck it as close to Japan as we could. The bombers took off, and then the aircraft carrier got out of there. And the bombers dropped their bombs on Tokyo and flew over Tokyo into China and tried to land behind the friendly Chinese lines so that they could be rescued by the Chinese army. Most of the flight crews were rescued. Some were captured by the Japanese in eastern China, and a lot of those guys were executed as terrorists. But the message to the Japanese was, no, what your government has been telling you is a lie. You are not invulnerable. We're coming for you. And when the American people heard that just a few months after Pearl Harbor, we had actually bombed Tokyo, that really helped morale. The turning point of the war in the Pacific took place only 6 months after Pearl Harbor. And it was the campaign with the island of Midway in the middle of it, which was an American naval and army base. And if the Japanese had been able to take it with the Midway airfields, they would have been able to bomb Pearl Harbor whenever they wanted to. We knew it. They knew it. We figured they were coming. But they organized, if you look at that map, a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands. But we kept intercepting their messages. And we could decode it to the point where we knew that they were planning an attack. But their code word for Midway was just the letters AF. And we weren't sure what AF meant. So we sent out, an innocent little message saying that Midway Island's water purification plant had broken down. And then we started intercepting messages from the Japanese saying that when they invaded AF, they would need to bring their own bottled water. And thus we knew AF was Midway. So we were waiting for them, but it was still an incredible battle. I don't know if any of you saw the movie Midway that was out last fall. It actually did a pretty good job of depicting the history of that event. And when I asked why did we win World War II, I think somebody wrote luck, and this was one of those battles because our first two waves of airplanes attacking the four Japanese aircraft carriers had failed to put a dent in them. But the third wave hit just at the right time when the Japanese planes were back on the decks of those aircraft carriers, refueling, reloading bombs, and we came in with dive bombers, and in the end we destroyed all four Japanese carriers. They got one of ours, the Yorktown, but this was the turning point in the war because from this point on, Japan was on the defensive, and we were on the offensive. So now the matter was strategy. How do we go about Japan? And Roosevelt had to balance out the long-standing but very important rivalry between the Army and the Navy. So if you look at that map, you can see two blue arrows, and the lower blue arrow was the southern recruit approach to Japan, and that was led by the Army. They had to get to these island groups and ships, to be sure, but the Army was doing most of the fighting. Whereas the higher Blue Arrow, that was the Navy's approach. And their ground troops, as some of you, I'm sure, are aware, are the United States Marines. So both services got a little bit of the action. And the other thing that we had to do, we couldn't attack every single island that the Japanese had occupied. So we had to pick and choose. And the strategy became known as island hopping. We would hop past some islands and attack other islands. Now, what distinguished the islands that we had to attack from the islands we didn't care about? It was simple. If an island had an airfield, we had to have it. And so those were the islands that produced the costliest battles to both sides. Not going to talk about too many of the battles, but this one was especially gruesome. The battle for Saipan in 1944. And what was so special about this island? Well, it had an airfield. You know, a lot of them did. But if we seized Saipan, along with the other islands very close to it, the Mariana Island Group, we would be within bombing range with huge land-based, long-range bombers, starting with, B-17s, B-25s, but eventually B-29s, the super fortress. We could bomb the main islands of Japan. And again, they knew it, we knew it. The battle was tremendously costly. And this was an indication of what lay in store for us. 93% of the Japanese soldiers defending Saipan died in that battle. The other 7% probably, were concussed and captured while they were unconscious or something, because they'd been told not to surrender. But we captured Saipan, and with that, we began the bombing of the main Japanese islands. That wasn't easy, because the bombing from Saipan to the Japanese islands ran past an island called Iwo Jima, which had not just one airfield, but 2 airstrips on it. The Japanese used to attack our bombing raids all the time. So it was clear that we had to have Iwo Jima in order to have a successful bombing campaign against Japan. And again, they knew it, we knew it. And so in February of 1945, the Battle of Iwo Jima began. And the commander of the Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, and if you're looking for a great movie about World War II, Letters from Iwo Jima, which tells the story from the Japanese side, is incredible. He brought his troops together, 22,000 Japanese soldiers, and said, basically, you guys are all going to die for the emperor, but before you die, you need to all kill 10 Americans. And think about that. If 22,000 Japanese had each killed 10 Americans, well, I don't see how we could have continued the war. They didn't. They killed a heck of a lot of Americans, but they didn't kill 10 apiece. The most famous photograph of the war, one of the most famous photographs of all time, the Iwo Jima flag racing. This was not staged. Some people think, oh, that photograph was staged. It was not. What was unusual was that this was the second flag that was put on top of Mount Suribachi. The original flag went up without a photograph, and then some officer down in a ship just off the coast, who hadn't done much of anything, saw that flag and said, I want it for my, museum collection or something. So he ordered some soldiers to go up to the top of the mountain, take down the original flag, and put that one up. And obviously that's the one that became famous. But of those 6 guys raising that flag, and when the American people saw that flag in the news, or that flag raising in the newspapers, they thought, "Oh, great! We captured Iwo Jima. We're almost winning the war." That was like in the 3rd day of the battle. And the battle lasted a month, and 3 of those 6 guys were killed in the battle. As I said, very costly. Almost 7,000, not 220,000, but almost 7,000 Americans died in that battle. And again, you can see the percentage of the Japanese who died. If you look at those photographs and I say, what's that? Some of you might say, well, that's got to be Hiroshima or Nagasaki. No, that's Tokyo. And that is not the result of atomic bombs. That is a result of another little invention that we made during the war, something called napalm, which is sort of jellified gasoline that bursts into flames on contact with oxygen. And since the Japanese cities back then were made primarily of wood, it burned down much of Tokyo in one night, killing more people than either atomic bomb did. Um, the firebombing of Tokyo doesn't get a lot of attention because it was done conventionally, but is actually far, far deadlier than the atomic bombs were. But still, Japan did not surrender. That was the thing. We were bombing them at will. They couldn't defend themselves anymore, and still they wouldn't surrender. We figured it was going to take a very, very costly invasion for us to defeat Japan. And so the next step was to take one of the small islands that was actually part of Japan. And that island was called Okinawa, the site of a large contingent of Japanese soldiers. And this battle, as you can see, took 3 months. And every time we, engaged in one of these battles, as we got closer and closer to the main islands, it became costlier and costlier. Look at that killed in action number for us, 19,000. And again, the percentage of Japanese who died in this battle was above 90%. This was one of the battles where the Japanese began to make use of the kamikaze planes. Kamikaze, the Japanese word that means divine wind, something that had happened in the 13th century when the Mongols were turned back by a typhoon. Well, the Japanese didn't think they had time to wait for a typhoon to sweep our navy back into the Pacific. So they tried to create their own man-made typhoon with kamikaze planes. And these were terrifying because these were the first suicide bombers in the modern world. Those planes loaded up with explosives. The pilots had no parachutes. And it didn't matter what you did to them. They were just going to try to fly into the decks of ships. But the kamikazes, they killed a lot of Americans. They did a lot of damage, but they did not turn us back. And we captured Okinawa at the end of June 1945. And so now the plan for the invasion of Japan was 2 steps. We were going to invade the island of Kyushu, which is one of the southern of the 4 main Japanese islands. It's the southernmost. We figured, we would capture that in the fall of 1945. It would be very costly. And then in the spring of 1946, we would invade the main island of Honshu, the island that contains Tokyo. But then President Truman, after he became president when Roosevelt died in April of 1945, learned of a secret project, the Manhattan Project, which had the promise of delivering a couple of atomic bombs that we might be able to use to end the war. And so now the decision that Truman had to make was whether or not to use them. So there's the Enola Gay. That was the plane that delivered the bomb on Hiroshima. And Tinian Island was one of those islands in the Mariana Island group close to Saipan. So now we're going to talk about that fateful decision of the atomic bomb and how history has looked at it.